This is a video oral history interview with James L. Mullins, Jim Mullins, Dean of Libraries, and the date is November 13th, 2017, being interviewed by Sammie Morris with the Purdue Libraries Archives. Jim, thank you for sitting down with us today to talk about your career at Purdue.
Well, it's something I always enjoy talking about, and as I was walking down here, I thought, oh, I didn't bring any notes. And then I thought, well, if I can't remember it from my mind, there's no reason why I would want to write notes. So I'm just going to go from my memory.
Well, there's a lot to cover because you've been here since 2004 and you've made so many strides, not only in the libraries here, but I think on a national and international level for libraries and universities. So I'm going to try to hit some of the highlights, but I hope that you will jump in with things that I may overlook that were important to you as part of your time here.
Okay.
So when we left off in your previous interview, you were just wrapping up your time at MIT. And you discussed with someone who had interviewed you at Harvard that you were going to come to Purdue. So what was, in your mind, the driving force behind you selecting Purdue over other institutions that you might have transitioned to at that time?
What attracted me about Purdue, and I knew it from my time at IU and also with our son having gone to school here from 88 to 93, so I knew Purdue from those two perspectives. But what really enchanted me when I came here to interview was how different the reality that I was able to perceive meeting President Jischke and Provost Sally Mason from what I thought might be the case. What I found was an environment that was really supporting being entrepreneurial, to being risk-taking, challenging, forward-looking, and I had had enough experience at MIT to help inform me about how scientists and engineers think. And I found out that I really liked it. And I saw that combination here at Purdue that I knew would be a good environment for me. And also, the thing that I did miss at MIT was the balance of the social sciences and humanities and art in addition to the science and engineering. Purdue seemed to hit me as being so much more balanced. The other thing that attracted me about Purdue was the joy that people seemed to have working here. When I met with the other deans, when I met with the people in the libraries, people seemed to be really happy to be here. I'm not sure that I've had that experience in every place I've worked. And that convinced me that it was a good place to come. I had interviewed at other places, and oftentimes I would come in second. And when I would find out who the person was that was chosen for the position, I would know that person is the better fit than I. They had a particular expertise, a particular qualification that made them a better fit for that institution. When I interviewed at Purdue, I knew this was my job. I knew I was going to get the offer. I knew I would accept it. I just knew that it was the right fit. And it's not to say that I couldn't have done these other jobs, but I don't think I would have done them as well as the people who did get hired. And I don't think I would have had the opportunities or potentially the success that we've been able to do at Purdue if I had been at another institution. I think it was just the right combination of everything coming together.
It sounds that way. I'm curious, in your previous library administrative positions, had you interacted with Purdue as part of consortia or collaborative agreements or?
No, not really. That was the ironic thing. When I worked at Indiana at IU, Purdue was very standoffish. We didn't know it very well at all, and it didn't relate that well to the state. That was the ironic thing, is here we are the land-grant institution, but in the library world, Purdue was very separate and did not support the libraries in Indiana. And one of the first things I did upon arriving at Purdue, I was sitting at a statewide meeting in Indianapolis, and a person asked me, how do you feel about charging for interlibrary loan? And I said, I'm against it. And they said, oh, we're really glad to hear that. And I said, why? And they said every other university, every other college is not charging each other for interlibrary loan. Only Purdue and the IU Medical School is charging. And I said that will stop immediately. My sense was that as our land-grant institution and as Purdue's role, and if Notre Dame can provide interlibrary loan free to the state, why shouldn't Purdue? Now, it cost us. We had been gaining about $50,000 a year in income from interlibrary loan, but to me that was robbing our lesser fortunate universities and colleges in the state than Purdue, and we were able to absorb it. A little while later, I was at a statewide public library meeting, and a public librarian came up to me and said, "I hear you're no longer charging the academic libraries for interlibrary loan." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Could you do the same thing for publics?" And I said, "Are we still charging you?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "That will stop too." And so we provided interlibrary loan for the state of Indiana, whether it's public or academic or school libraries. So it was one of those things to really align Purdue with our mission within the library's mission with the university's mission.
Thinking back to when you first started at Purdue, did the provost or anyone who was involved in the decision to hire you give you any ideas about things they wanted to see happen by the person in your position?
No, not really. The one thing that the president said right after I arrived, President Jischke, in those days, the president and the provost made either a semester or an annual meeting with every department on campus. So they came to the library shortly after I came and more or less gave us an ultimatum and said, you either get on board with where the university is going or you're going to be sidelined. And I thought, well, that's pretty much pretty frank, because I think they saw the libraries as more or less still caught in the past and not really thinking about what was the future of the university and therefore what was the future that we needed to do in the libraries to align with it. So that's, I think, probably the first message I got from the president and the provost. The provost was very much oriented towards letting each dean manage their own area. And so I can remember her telling me, "Jim, you don't want me thinking about the library in the morning when I wake up. That's not a good thing, because that means there's a problem." So I always thought, don't want to do something that's going to make her be thinking about the library in those early morning waking hours, because that obviously is not going to be something good. But I always had the sense that she had my back, and so did the president, that if I had to make tough decisions, they would be there to support me.
That's great. What was the relationship with the libraries and the rest of campus when you came in?
It was in a transition. When I arrived, the library's materials budget had just been moved into the libraries. Prior to that, the materials budget for each college and school was the domain of that college or school. And when President Jischke and Provost Mason came, they saw that as unworkable. And so they moved the budgets from the colleges and schools to have it all under the libraries. And thank God they did, because that made life so much easier. But it also caused a bit of a challenge at first, because initially there was an understanding that there could not be a reallocation of funds from one area to another. So we had to maintain the funding for a particular school or college at the level that it had. And only after 5 years, and I think I came in maybe the second or third year, we could reallocate the funding, because some schools weren't using their funds totally. Other ones were running out very early. And so it was obvious that the allocations were way out of sync with what the needs were. So once after we got past that, we were able to align the allocations better. And now we really don't allocate funding at all by department or schools. We meet the needs as they present themselves in the total budget.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I was very curious about is when you began at Purdue in your first 3 months, did you have a sense of what some of your immediate goals would be for that first year?
Well, my biggest goal was to go out and speak to every department head and dean and other school heads or other unit heads. I needed to find out what were the issues that they were confronting and how could the libraries help address them. So I made the commitment that I would meet with every department head, school head, and found out then that there were 75 departments on campus, plus the deans, plus IT, student services, all of this. So I set up a plan where I would meet and just talk with each one. I wouldn't be telling them about what the libraries can do because I wasn't totally certain I knew what the libraries could do. What I asked them was, what are your challenges? What are the things that keep you awake at night? What are the issues that your students are finding? And what are the graduate students doing? And where are they going afterwards? And then I would think, okay, what can the libraries do to help address their problems? And then I would talk to them about what we could do to help them. Because if I had come in and started telling them about what the libraries could do, they've heard that. I mean, that would be nothing new to them. What they wanted to hear was how could we address the problem they were facing. And typically after our meetings, they would be overwhelmed that the libraries could step in and help with a particular issue. I'll give you an example. Very early on, I started hearing about the challenge of people had in managing data. And typically, libraries haven't been the first place to go for finding support for managing data. And as I would drill down into it, I would find that what the issue was, not the storage of data. They said that's not a problem. We can do that through information technology, through ITAP. But the challenge was, how do we organize it? How do we identify it? How do we retrieve it? And how do we preserve it? And my answer would be, we can do that. And there would be this incredulous look on their faces and say, how can the libraries do that? And I said, that's what our training is. And they would still be somewhat quizzical about how do the libraries have anything to do with data. And I would have to explain to them, you're seeing us from what you have traditionally seen us do, and that is catalog books, make journals available, check out books, store books, everything that's tangible. But if you think about all of those tangible items as being bits of data, then it makes it more understandable that what we're doing in libraries manages data. And the data can be intangible, things that are digital, as well as something tangible like a book or a journal. So I had a biology professor say to me, he was a distinguished professor, and I'm not sure if he's retired, if he's still here or not. But anyway, he said to me, Jim, I don't want to be rude, but I have no idea what a librarian knows. And I said, well, let me give you an example, and I'll use myself as a illustration. I said, I've had one course in biology in my whole life, and that was as a sophomore in high school. So no one is more ignorant of biology than me. But if I were given the responsibility to be the biology librarian, within about 6 months, I would be able to tell you where are the major information sources, what are the places you would go to find specific information about a particular topic, what are the terms that are most identifiable within them, what's the meaning of those terms. And he said, you could do that? And I said, any well-trained, good librarian can do that. I said, that's what our knowledge is. We understand how access points work into particular disciplines. Now, I wouldn't be able to tell you at all what you would do with that information. That's what you do as a biologist. But as a librarian, I can tell you how all of this fits together with the scope and knowledge base that is what is considered to be part of our scholarly record. And And he was dumbfounded by it. And it made me realize right then, we have been extremely remiss as a profession in helping people understand what we're taught and what we know to do. I had a librarian help me understand that. She was a librarian who was here when I came, and she was in the biology library. And she had been working as a biologist, a working lab scientist, biologist, a bench scientist. Then she moved over into computational biology, and then she got a library degree. Well, she and I would have these discussions. Actually, sometimes they were arguments. And one day she said to me, after we had been having one of our discussions or arguments, she said, "Oh, you're thinking like a librarian." And I said, "What is that? What am I saying that makes you say I'm thinking like a librarian?" And she said, "You're trying to see how everything fits together, how this piece connects to this piece, and this piece connects to this, and if you do this, you're going to get that connection." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "People don't think that way. That's the way a librarian thinks. As a researcher, I think vertically. I think about how things connect in a very, very narrow way. I don't think about how everything fits within a continuum." And I said, "But we do." And she said, "That's it. And you do it so automatically, you don't even realize you're doing it." When I said this to my wife, she said, "I could have told you that." She said, "You're always thinking about how everything connects and how this piece works with this and how this is going to have an impact on this." And I said, "Well, I just thought that was the way everybody thought." And she said, "No, they don't." And I started realizing that's a skill, a knowledge, a science that we have been able to master that people don't recognize. The other thing that the other area that I had a problem when I first arrived was talking to computer scientists. When I started going out and telling people that we can help manage data, I had a computer science professor come to me and saying, "You're using the term metadata all wrong." And I said, "We are?" And he said, "Yes, you have no idea what you're talking about." And he said, "We understand metadata, not you." And I said, "I've been a librarian for 40 years, and no one has claimed cataloging and classification before now." And he said, "Is that what you mean?" And I said, "Yes, we're talking about how do we describe, how do we identify, and how do we retrieve the information or the content within the database." And he said, "Oh, we don't care about that." And I said, "I know, you're talking about the metadata as it's relating to the software." I said, "We don't deal with that." And he said, "Oh, we complement each other." And I said, "Exactly." So more or less what my challenge was when I first got here was helping to define what was going to be the unique role that we as librarians and library faculty could bring to the campus that it was missing, because they didn't have, there was no discipline other than library science that deals with how to identify, classify, and retrieve information. That's what we do. And it's taken a while to get that understanding across, but it's still slowly sinking in. And so I have felt very, very proud of the reaction on campus to helping us understand, or helping the campus understand, the role of library faculty. I'll give you another example of a really quite interesting experience I had. After the computer science department finally figured out that we were complementary to their department, they asked me if we could do a joint appointment between the libraries and computer science. And the College of Science at that time was having a program where they would help fund a faculty position if it was a department within the College of Science and another college. In this case, it was the libraries. So we created a faculty position that combined both library faculty and computer science. But I had to go make a presentation to a committee in the College of Science that had a representative from each one of the departments. And when I was introduced, the man who was introduced from physics appeared to start scowling at me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder what I've done that would make this man scowl at me. And I thought, oh my gosh, this was on a Wednesday. And on a Monday, Michael Fossmeyer, the physics librarian at the time, had announced to the physics department that we were canceling our print subscriptions to all physics journals and only going electronic. And I thought, this man is going to kill me. And so I got done with the presentation, and I was leaving the room when this physics professor got up and ran across the room with his hand outstretched and said, "Can I shake your hand?" And I said, "Well, yes, but can you tell me why?" And he said, "Until you arrived, we only thought about the libraries as being a wonderful place where there were good people who paid our bills in order to ensure that we had our access to our databases and our journals." He said, "In the last few years, we have had librarians coming and working with us on our research projects, collaborating on instruction." And he said, "Are you going to create a library school here?" And I said, "No. The library faculty are your colleagues. They will be the ones who collaborate with you on data management, on research you're undertaking, or instruction." I said, "The library science faculty here are your colleagues." He said, "Whatever, we have to have you." I thought I would never hear that from a physics professor. So that's what gave me a lot of encouragement that there was a real possibility to create a very different kind of relationship between Purdue libraries and the campus.
Well, the libraries at Purdue were definitely at the forefront amongst other university libraries across the country in really seeing data curation, data management as a role for librarians. Can you talk about how, after you began to hear this information from the department heads that data was a need, how did you start to build that infrastructure in the libraries for being able to meet that need?
Well, the first thing I did was I found out that I couldn't do it all. I mean, I wasn't going to be able to do it all. So I looked around the libraries and identified Scott Brandt. Scott Brandt at that time was information technology specialist or something in that, where he would be teaching people how to use new technologies. Mm-hmm. And Scott was a full professor, and I went to him and I said, "Scott, we really need someone who can follow and make contacts with faculty after I talk to department heads to really begin to understand what this is that we need to uncover." So we created his position, and he reminded me the other day what the title was, Interdisciplinary Research Librarian. And so he and I would go out and meet with faculty and listen to what their problems were, and then try to figure out how to work with them. Well, about this time, NSF was sending out a researcher to meet with on campuses to determine what were the challenges associated with managing data. And Jim Bottom, who was at the time the Vice President for Information Technology, contacted me and said, "Would you like to meet with her?" And I said yes. And so we were the last people she was meeting with, Scott and I, the last time she had at the on her visit to campus. And we walked in, and she had her head in her hands, so you could tell that she was tired, really tired. And she said, "Okay, where's your PowerPoint?" And I said, we don't have any PowerPoint. We're just going to talk." And she looked down and she said, "Oh, you're the librarians." And we said, "Yes." And she said, "You have the answer." And I said, "Yes, but what's the question?" That's the part that we don't know. And so we told her what we were doing and what we thought we should do. And she said, "You're right on target." She said, "You're right on target." She said, "We have to figure out how to archive these massive amounts of data that are being generated as part of grants from NSF and others that are not being mined effectively." And so she said, "You're right on target about what needs to be done." My question to her then at the time was, so let's say that we create this ideal world where all this data is identified and it's retrievable. Will the researchers use it? Will they trust it? Will it have the variables identified that they need to do their research? And she said, that's the question. That's the issue. Will they ever use the data that is being created by someone else? And that's what they're not sure about. Shortly after that, Scott and I were called in to a meeting with a professor in biology whose NIH grant was turned down because he didn't include a data management plan. And he was doing research in an area that I knew nothing about. And as I was sitting there listening to him describe his research project, I thought, I'm going to have to go out and do so much reading to understand his area so that I can understand what his data management needs are. But then I looked around and there were two people on his research team. One was a computer scientist and one was a statistician. And I went over to them and I said, do you understand the research he's doing in this area? And they said, no. We only listen to what it is we need to know in order to do what we need to do as part of the project. And they said, don't listen to the rest of it. And I went, oh, yes, of course. That's the way we have to do this. We have to listen to what it is that's relevant to what our expertise is. We don't have to understand the research that he's doing. So a few weeks later, I was invited by a botanist to come over and listen to his research and listen to how he was describing how he was archiving his data. And he was telling me all about his research and why it was important. And I was letting it go in one ear and out the other because I thought, I am not going to retain this. I don't understand it. I don't really need to understand it. But then he started describing the data, the taxonomy he was using, how he was tagging it, and I started asking all kinds of questions about it. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, this is when most people's eyes glaze over. And I said, oh, no, this is the interesting part. This is what I find interesting. And it's once again understanding that this is our specialization, that understanding how somebody is describing their data, what kind of terms they're using, where they're getting those terms, that's exactly what we do. In the past, it would have been subject headings and C and C also references. So no, I found that very exciting. So over the period of several years, I met with every department head on campus. And I would hear these stories. I would then go back and Scott or the liaisons would start becoming a bit more cognizant of what was going on. And one episode I had was with the chair or the head of the Civil Engineering School of Civil Engineering, Kathy Banks. And she was a very difficult person to get an appointment with, or lunch with. My assistant was trying constantly and trying to get her to agree. And she would deny it and say she didn't need to talk to the library. Finally, she agreed. And I had been told that Kathy was a person that had very strong opinions and did not hold back. So when I met her for lunch, where I had been meeting all the rest of the people during this time, I walked in, I walked up to her, and she said, Jim, I have no idea why we're meeting. My idea of a library is it's full of dusty books and dusty librarians. And I said, oh, you really don't know what we can do. And so I asked her what her research area was. And she said, well, I study the infrastructure of cities, waters and sewer. And I said, well, you must deal a lot with maps. And I said, have you worked with our geographical information specialist? And she said, I didn't know you had one. I said, let me put him in touch with you. And I said, you must deal a lot with data. And she said, oh, yes. And I said, well, let me have one of our data people meet with you. And so eventually, she ended up bringing on the GIS specialist onto grants with her, the data people onto grants with her. She became one of our biggest advocates. And I always look back at that and thinking how important it was to be able to connect with her in her specific area of research, because researchers will bring you in if they think that somehow what you do is going to make them more effective and their time more efficiently used. If they think you're just going to be a time sink, they won't have anything to do with you. But by showing her that we could actually make her more productive was beneficial. And then I mentioned GIS. GIS is one of the areas, too, that we first took on. I had a faculty member come to me and say, I'm more or less the GIS specialist on campus, but I really have other things to be doing, and I'm in the college VAG. You really need to be thinking about developing a GIS program in the libraries that can serve the entire campus. And so that was one of the first positions, first areas we ever created was GIS. And hired Chris Miller. He was our only candidate. We never let him know that. And he ended up creating a lab that we funded that he said was as good as any in the country, if not better. So we were able to really develop a really good GIS program. The thing that happened out of the data management program was we got people excited about data management, and the librarians were working in the area of data management. But then they would be asked, well, what do we do with it? Once we have these data sets, where do we go with it? And that's kind of the next story. I don't know what your next question might be.
So there are a few indicators, I think, of real leaps and bounds being made with the agenda of data management in the libraries. And one of the ones I think of is when the D2C2 was established. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yes. That came about because we were going out to get a grant from the National Science Foundation. And we were going to be the lead for this grant. It was a $25 million grant to help develop software that would help create a database or data management system. But I said, there is no one that's going to sign on if the libraries are the lead. It's just too out of the norm. The faculty wouldn't see it. So we said, we've got to create a center, because the center is where a lot of the research proposals go from. So working with Michael and Scott, we came up with D2C2, Distributed Data Curation Center. And that's what we used as the call out to get people to come to make presentations for this grant proposal. NSF was giving these $25 million grants. They were going to give 3 of them. And it was to develop a software that would allow for data management. Well, our proposal was built on, at that time, the nanotechnology software. It didn't have a separate name at the time. It's now called Hub Zero. But at the time, we just had to keep referring to it as the software that runs Nanotechnology Center, which was a problem because it wasn't very descriptive. We turned in a grant proposal. Scott and I worked on it. Scott did the lion's share of the work. And we had to get it in at Christmas, I think in 2006, 2007, somewhere in there. And we submitted it, and we were proposing this software and we had people from across campus. We had computer scientists, we had physicists, IT people. It was a good group. And I was the lead PI. And I actually went to a professor in engineering who had been a former division head within NSF and saying, should I be leading this? I don't think that they're going to take this seriously with a librarian leading this project. And he said, Jim, only the libraries can lead this. You're the only ones that see how all of this fits together. Every other unit is only looking at their own specific interest. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, we'll go forward with it. Well, we got a ranking of good on the grant, but we weren't funded. And so that's when I said, okay, we're going to do this on our own. And I went to the provost and to the vice president for IT, or for research at the time, and said, we need $1.8 million to get the software, to develop the software modifications, to hire people, to develop this program, to get the programmers. And they did. They funded it. Within a short time, with less than a year, and we also said it has to be built so that it's compliant with the NISO standard for a certified data preservation facility. I said we have to figure out, we have to build this so that it's going to meet all of the requirements of a trusted data repository. And we ended up building that system, not me, I mean Michael and Scott and others, built what became Purdue University Research Repository in less than a year. Once we had it up and working, and it was in a model that was totally unique, I sent a link to it to the program director at NSF, who knew our proposal very well that we had submitted. And I said, does this look familiar? And he said, it was your proposal for the 25 million. And I said, yes, and we did it for 1.8 million at Purdue. That system became more or less a state-of-the-art at that time, and this would have been 2008, 2009, for creating a data repository. And that, I think, is one of the hallmarks of Purdue's leap into that field. The other thing that we did was we championed doing institutes for other libraries so that other libraries could understand what it is that Purdue had done so they could do the same thing. Now, our research office here said, well, don't do that. We have an advantage here. Why would we want to give an advantage to another university? And my sense is we collaborate. In libraries, we collaborate. We share. And so we needed to bring other universities along with us. So is that enough about data management right
Well,
now?
were there any other things after PUR was operational and up and running that you see as real indicators of success from that time that it went live until the present? Like, I know that we were founding members of certain organizations. Could you speak to that? Or
Well, the other thing that PUR does that is unique to Purdue is that we have a total relationship all the way from the beginning research project creation, when the researcher starts coming up with their proposal, and they have to include the data management plan, and they'll oftentimes include PUR in that, to the point to where once the grant is awarded, the libraries come back in again to help them manage that grant. So that even in the sponsored programs area, they know the libraries are part of this process. That's not typical in most universities still. So that's very unique. The fact, too, that we have developed a cohort of library faculty who their specialization is not necessarily data management, but they understand the theory and the principles behind it. And we have data specialists who can then work with them in a specific area. So that's also unique. The other identification, an area that we became identified was on the international level. We were starting to be invited to various programs, conferences to speak about what we had done. And there was a movement to create an organization, an international organization that would create digital object identifiers for data sets so that a data set could have a unique identifier so that the provenance could be validated, so that whoever created that data set would always get the credit for creating that data set. There was no provenance in the past. And so the signing the DOI, or the digital object identifier, meant that there was now a record of who created that data set. Well, this was done as an international initiative, and it was an organization called DataCite. Purdue and the University of California in the United States were the two founding members from the United States, along with other organizations from the UK, Europe, elsewhere in the world. So we were one of the two founding members in the United States. We also became one of the two universities that assigned DOIs within the United States. So anyone who wanted a DOI either had to go to the University of California or to Purdue. We were also very instrumental in work in the area of IATL, the International Association of Technological University Libraries. We hosted a conference here in 2010 that people still say was one of the hallmarks of how a program, a conference should have a unique focus and stay true to that focus. They said it was an incredibly well-honed program. Now that's 7 years ago. So that was probably towards the height of how well we were in the forefront of leading the data management movement.
well, one of the other areas that I think has been definitely an area of strategic focus during your tenure in the libraries has been information literacy. And you spoke to this in your previous interviews about why that was so important to you. One of the things I wanted to ask was, how did the establishment of the W. Wayne Booker Chair position occur?
Okay. Well, Wayne Booker had been involved with the libraries maybe for 2 years before I came. it was while he was vice president for operations, or chief financial officer at Ford Motor Company. And he was noticing at Ford, or others had noticed and brought to his attention, that they were hiring outstanding graduates, either engineers or business graduates, who had great credentials from places like Michigan or Purdue, but they couldn't solve problems. And once they drilled down into it, they discovered it was because they couldn't determine what was the right information they needed in order to solve the problem. He came down and saw my predecessor, and she told him, well, the primary responsibility lies with the college or schools, but the libraries can collaborate with them on teaching information literacy. And so initially what he did was commit, I think it was $200,000, to develop a test through Educational Testing Service, ETS, that would assess what the knowledge was of an incoming student, both of information technology but also of information in general. So when I arrived, he had supported that project. It created a test that ETS distributed, but unfortunately it was a fairly expensive test and very few places utilized it. But also there was no program in place for what do we do? What happens if we determine that the students are ignorant both of IT and information literacy? What do we do? I mean, if we're just providing a test, that's not really providing the solution. So when I arrived, I got to know him, and I suggested that what we need to do is fund a position that would help us and cause us to be always looking out and researching the area of information literacy. Having a person whose research area was in the area of information literacy to ensure that we were on the cutting edge of what was going on and making sure that we had an advocate on campus for information literacy. We gave him a proposal, and he ultimately funded it through an insurance policy of about $2.7 million. We ended up with the first endowed chair in information literacy anywhere in the world, and we're very lucky to have attracted Dr. Sharon Weiner into the position, who just retired this summer. And that would have been in about 2011, somewhere in there. And so that's how we got the position. He was adamant that students had to learn how to be good information users and assessors and integrators. And if there wasn't some mechanism to do that, he was concerned that it wouldn't happen. Now, the other thing that happened, it was a very, very opportune time. As we hired Sharon, the university was going through a core curriculum revision. And at the same time, the library committee was taking on information literacy as its focus for the year. And so we had that combination come together in the most opportune way, because ultimately information literacy became one of the core requirements that all students had to achieve as part of their undergraduate curriculum. And Sharon was instrumental in helping to get that defined. There was a committee formed that helped assess what courses were going to actually be able to be identified as fulfilling the information literacy requirement. So it was a win-win in every way. And now it's embedded within the curriculum, and people know that it's an expectation that has to be met in the first year and within the major. And people realize that in today's world, if you don't understand how to assess between true information, reliable information, and information that's either erroneous or has a particular viewpoint or argument to make, you're not going to be dealing with factual results.
Absolutely. Well, I think We'd talked before about how you had had a personal experience with information and for your dissertation, and this is what led you to
For my honors thesis.
for your honors thesis. And you were a proponent of this for the students, but why do you think it's important for a university and for the library of a university for the librarians to have this role in learning?
Well, if we don't do it, who else will? Information literacy is endemic to what it is that we do as librarians, and that is we used to do it on a one-to-one basis at the reference desk. When a person would come to the reference desk, this is before the internet, and they had a question, the reference librarian would take them over to the reference materials or the indexes or the abstracts or whatever and instruct them on how to locate that information. Now, we did it on a one-to-one basis. Sometimes we did it in a class, but that was not that effective. But we usually did it on a one-to-one basis, so we were teaching and instructing on an individual basis. With the advent of the web, those kinds of ready reference kind of questions or instructional aspects have pretty much disappeared. In the past, we might have had somebody walk in and say, I need to find the population of India, or I need to find the gross national product of Zambia. And we would know what reference tool to go to. Then we would instruct them, say, okay, here's the tool you need to go to. Now, if you need to find similar information, here's the information you might get from this tool. So we were teaching that. Today, those kind of reference tools are no longer necessary for the most part, because with the right kind of due diligence, you can search on the web and find authoritative and accurate information that doesn't need mediation from a librarian. So that's why we had to figure out some way to instruct the students about how do you assess information? How do you make sure that the information you're reaching is accurate information? And doing that through the web and through all the resources that are available on the web freely, or through the resources that we subscribe to and provide access for our students and faculty.
Well, I think we've talked about data management and we've talked about information literacy. There are a couple of other areas that you have definitely championed during your time as the dean. Could you talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments that have been made in tying the libraries with scholarly publishing and the press?
Okay. Well, the university press has reported to the libraries, or to the library dean, for about 30 years. It was very early on. It was moved from the provost to the dean of the graduate school to the libraries. But it was a straight line, but it could have been a dotted line for all intents and purposes, because the press was an auxiliary enterprise, which means it sits somewhat on the outside of the university because it creates income. And for that reason, it has to be somewhat separate from the university. And also sat off campus or on the very periphery of campus. In the old days, that was necessary because of just the management of inventory. But by the time I arrived, inventory management was not an issue. That was pretty much done by our publisher, and we published smaller runs, so there wasn't so much in the way of backlog or back files. So what we started doing was integrating the press more and more into the libraries. And then about 10 years ago, there was a change in the press director. And at that time, we also thought we're going to move the press physically into the library space so that it could be in the center of campus and it could avail itself of services from the libraries, from the business office, from IT, from HR, all of those areas that right now were having to be done inside the press and demanding their time, we were now able to provide to them from the libraries. And so that it allowed them to focus more directly on the role as the press. We also were able to eliminate the debt. The press had accumulated a fairly substantial debt just over the period of years. And before we could hire a new director, we had to resolve that because I knew there was no way the press would ever work themselves out of that hole. Luckily, the provost agreed and covered the debt that we had, and we hired an energetic director, Charles Watkinson, and he was able to take the press. I even got funds from the provost to give him some venture capital so that he had the opportunity to do some new initiatives that allowed him to explore new ways of doing things.
I think it's been clear that the Libraries has been recognized for innovation in scholarly publishing, and I think this goes back to probably your first or second year of joining the Libraries when you saw that we needed an institutional repository. What do you see as the next stage, I guess, for libraries and scholarly publishing? Is there another big challenge yet to be met?
Well, I think the biggest challenge now is to get the universities, faculty and administration, to realize that we have got to do a better job of recording and documenting the research coming out of our faculty, and then monitoring what's being done and what the options could be for publishing in open access repositories and open access publishing. Right now, the scholarly record is so dominated by the commercial publishers that we're hamstrung about what our options are, and the costs every year are skyrocketing. I mean, this past year we needed $550,000 to pay to cover the same costs that we would have had last year just because of inflation. And so that model just cannot continue. But everybody looks to open access as being the salvation. Well, it could if the people who are producing the research and the scholarship would be willing to commit to publishing in open access vehicles. And the problem is, for promotion and tenure, people still look at the traditional journals, which happen to be published by the monopolistic publishers. And so as long as there's a need from the scholarly community for the publication mechanism through the commercial publishers, we don't have a lot of clout, even though we do have all the clout because we produce the research. It's just the most incredible thing. I had often thought that this would be resolved before I retired, because this started becoming an issue over 20 years ago, really even more than 20 years. And I thought surely in 20 years we would have figured out a way to beat it. If nothing else, it's gotten worse because of the monopoly has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's becoming a real challenge. The other area that we have been involved in scholarly publishing is the open access publishing itself. We helped, Purdue was one of 3 universities that set up the Library Publishing Coalition about, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And we did that in order to give more of a imprimatur to the fact that libraries can be publishers as well. Not on the same level as a university press, because a university press has a more of a vetting process than libraries publishing would. Libraries publishing is publishing more white papers, tech reports, items that are of great interest to the research and library community or research community or the university community, but are not being vetted by scholars.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the WALC, the Wilmeth Active Learning Center. Could you tell me when you first began to form in your mind an idea for a building that would bring together libraries and active learning spaces, and how that came about?
Well, the first iteration of this, the first idea for this whole building came shortly after I arrived, when I realized that it was time for the science and engineering libraries to come together. That trying to manage 6 or 7 science engineering libraries and manage staffing, collections in a world that was becoming more and more digital didn't make sense. And at first I realized there was some opposition from some of the science departments, but after a few years they even said they didn't see a need to have the collections right there. So I went to the provost and proposed that we work to build a combined science engineering library on the site of the old power plant. And her response was, nope, that has to be a classroom building. We need classrooms on campus. So then I said, well, okay, library and classroom building. So that's where we left it for quite a while. We would work on plans. We actually did an alternate because the cost to demolish the power plant, or the inclination or the desire or reason or willingness to even demolish the old power plant was practically nil. For a while then, we were looking at how to expand Potter to make it a combined science engineering library. And that was going to be about, it wasn't even that bad. It was only going to be about $10 million. But we couldn't find the funding for that. So then we kept going back to proposing this classroom library building. We would rise up to, maybe within 2 or 3 of the top priority on the building plan, but we would never get first place. Then what happened was the advent of active learning. Now, I'll go into just hopefully very briefly about what we mean by active learning. The university and the provost office and colleges were concerned that we were not having the proper amount of matriculation, or the highest level of matriculation, from freshman to sophomore year, and it was thought to be due to the very large lecture classes that were being taught in the first year in all kinds of fields, as diverse as chemistry, political science, sociology, history, and there was a sense that those large lecture courses were really causing a problem with success. We were at around 88% matriculation, and our peers were at around 93%. And our goal was to improve the matriculation rate.
Jim, you were talking about the inspiration for what eventually became the WALC. I believe you left off when you were talking about how the site for that building was intended to support learning and instruction.
Well, actually, I think I just finished talking about the issue with the fact that our students were not matriculating at the rate we were hoping.
Yes.
And the studies were showing that it was the impact of the large lecture halls. And so the combination, actually the libraries were very instrumental in helping to identify what the option would be. Because in the parish library, the library in Cranard, the parish library of management and economics, we created a room in there, an instructional room, that had no front of the room. It was so that you could teach and people could see the screens from anywhere they were sitting. And Dale Whitaker, who was the associate provost at the time, came in and said, we should be teaching in this way. This is the way the classrooms should be taught, where students could be working and teaching themselves, and the instructor could be roving throughout the room. And at the same time, it's when we were identifying the fact that these large lecture classes were causing a problem. So a program started that was Instruction Matters Purdue Academic Course Transformation, IMPACT. And that program brought together faculty who were willing to do this, and they were from all disciplines, about 16 of them. And they were each given an IT, an information technologist, a pedagogist, and a librarian. And the librarian was there to integrate information literacy into the courses, and then to help them teach and think about teaching their courses in a different way. Teach by their lecture being online, so that a student could watch the lecture at their own pace, or they could go back and look at it several times if they needed to understand it. And then but then they would work in teams where they would apply the principles or apply what they had learned and in a discussion mode. Because all the research shows that students learn better when they're given the opportunity to explore through discussion or through action what they are being taught. And the other thing that I sometimes bring back to faculty, and sometimes they'll argue with me on this, but let's say that you're a first-year physics student, and you have a professor who's lecturing who is a very well-known, very highly intelligent person in the area of physics, specialized area in physics, but teaching an intro course in physics to freshmen. Sometimes it's not possible for that person to understand why a student would be having an issue in understanding some principle of physics. But another student might, because they're at very close to the same level. So if you're bringing them into an area where they can collaborate and help each other, one student might help one student understand a certain principle. That same student might help another student understand a different principle. That a faculty member might have a difficult time bringing his ability to describe it down to the level of what a student needs to have at that point to understand the principle in physics. So at this time, it was determined to create this. Well, to be able to offer these courses, you needed to have classrooms that could support this kind of collaborative endeavor. Most classrooms are set up in tablet armchair rows, and therefore they would not lend themselves to collaborative instruction. And also, those classrooms were being used because they were already scheduled. So we ended up creating one classroom in the Hicks Undergraduate Library because we needed to have a classroom that could be dedicated to instructional impact programming. And when the librarians came to me and asked me if we would give up that space, I was at first reluctant to do so because it meant giving it up. It becomes assigned by the registrar. But I thought, if this is what the university needs, we should do it. So we agreed to do it. The provost spent a great deal of money renovating the room, bringing in new technology, new wireless, and then we saw something that was very interesting. Those classes started at 7:30 in the morning. Well, that's not when the library is the heaviest used, at first thing in the morning. And so the students were coming in to go to the class, and then the classes continued throughout the day. The use of the library starts gearing up late morning into the afternoon, and then in the evening is when we're the busiest into the night. Well, that classroom becomes available after 5:30 since it wasn't scheduled, and it became a wonderful study space. And we looked at this and we said, my gosh, this is a win-win situation. We not only have met the need for the classes, we now have a wonderful study space. So we ended up the next year creating 2 more classrooms in the Hicks Library to be able to meet the increasing need for active learning classrooms. And we saw something there that we had never seen before, and that was teams of students working in the libraries, then going into the classroom, having their class, coming out, sitting back in the library again, working in their teams, and sometimes the instructor coming out and sitting with them and talking with them. We had never seen this because we had never seen this kind of interaction between the spaces of the library and the classroom. So as we started thinking about our argument for the new building, we said what we can argue for is we need to have active learning classrooms, dedicated classrooms. And that's what was able to get us to the sweet spot. That if we had argued still for the classroom library building without a clarification of active learning, we wouldn't have been able to fund it. Now, that rose to the top, and we were also trying to figure out how would we get the legislature to fund things. The legislature had not given us funds in over 5 years for any building project. The last building project we had gotten was the Armstrong building, or a portion of it. And so we had to think, okay, what do we do that will get the legislature to willingly support a major project? Well, the legislature has no responsibility to support research facilities, athletic facilities or housing facilities. But they do have a responsibility to support libraries and classrooms for the undergraduates. So we said this project has got to go down there, and we've got to promote it. Well, we first called it the Classroom Library Facility. And Vic Lechtenberg, who was provost, interim provost at the time, said, if you send that down to the legislature, it'll never pass, because they'll see classroom library and they'll think that's the most boring, uncreative facility, and they won't support it. And so we had been calling it the Boiler Steam Commons as a way to help be able to sell it, because it's on the site of the old boiler plant, STEAM for science, technology, engineering, agriculture, and math, and commons just because it's a word. So anyway, but Ken Sandel spoke up and said, you cannot send this down with calling it boiler, with boiler in the name. And I said, what are they, all IU grads? And he said, no, it's just that the last time we went down to get money to replace one of our boilers in the South Power Plant, they said, bring no more boiler requests down to us. And we said, well, it's not for a boiler plant, it's for building, classroom building. He said, they won't look at it. They'll just see boiler and they'll just nix it. So that's when we said, well, it's about active learning. So then we said, well, let's call it the Active Learning Center. And that way they had to ask, what is it? And they had to delve into it to figure out what the project was. We sent students down to the legislature. They went into the hallways to help buttonhole legislators to talk about the building. We worked with our contacts within the legislature, but we were told, and we were asking for $50 million. The project was going to be $89 million, or $79 million. $50 million from the state, $13 million from the university, and then we had to raise $16 million. And so we were told that we would not get the funding the first year. But the last day of the legislative session, Ken Sandel called me and said, Jim, you'll never believe this, but they approved it. They approved the $50 million. And he said, not only that, it's in cash. We have never gotten cash for a project, only bonding authority. We don't even know how to handle cash. And I said, we get in the car, we drive to Indianapolis, we pick it up. He said, well, it's not quite that simple. So we got the money. Mitch had started the next year. This must have been in 2012. No, it must have been in 2013. Mitch the president created a memo of understanding about how the money had to be raised to ensure that the building would be fully funded. And I had to commit to raising half of the money before the power plant could be torn down. And the other half of the money all of the money had to be committed before the new building would start. We made it on April 30th before the May 1st deadline of having all the money committed. So the Wilmeth Active Learning Center opened in August of 17 with no debt. All the debt was covered. All the building costs was covered. The total project came out to be right around $100 million, because about $20 million was spent by the university to replace and rebuild all of the tunnels that came out of the old power plant and that connected the Wilmeth Active Learning Center and the Wilmeth Active Learning Center, and so that was about another $20 million. The reason why the Wilmeth Active Learning Center is so unique is that it's taken the best attributes of a library and the best attributes of a classroom and married them, brought them together. And by marrying them, you create a final product that's stronger and better than either of the two by themselves. So when you go into the Wilmeth Active Learning Center, you see aspects that look very much like a library: a large reading room, stacks, service desk, study areas, carrels. But then you'll see classrooms throughout the building. Those classrooms become study spaces after the end of the day. The library also extends throughout the building. As I tell people, wherever you see carpeting, that's the library. So you'll see carpeted areas on the ground floor, first floor, second floor, third floor. And those areas are all library spaces. But they're all integrated throughout the building so that it's a total, at night, more or less, the building becomes a total library. We also have space for 18 library faculty who represent the sciences and engineering. By bringing them together in one place, they all are able to work more collaboratively. So it's been a real win-win situation. We've already had visitors from nearly all parts of the world who have come here to see this building because it is unique. I see it as really being the first really 21st century library.
Yes, and of course with Purdue's history with library spaces, the libraries in Purdue has not had as many facilities, standalone buildings, I think, as one might expect for the age of the university. So we had the original 1913 building and we had the undergraduate library, and now we have the WALC. It's already, I think, attracted a lot of attention. And of course, the reading room is a beautiful space that's named after you. How did you first find out that that space would carry your name?
Well, that was over 2 years ago. The building was under construction and was in progress. And at one of the Dean's Advisory Councils, the Library Dean's Advisory Councils, Larry Heiler, who was chair of the Advisory Council at lunch, got up and started giving this testimonial to me, or eulogy. And I said, Larry, I'm not retiring for 2 years, and I don't think I'm dying. And he said, just wait, just wait. And so then he read this note from President Daniels saying that it was his honor to announce that he had approved the naming of the reading room in my honor. I was flabbergasted. I mean, absolutely flabbergasted. Terribly honored, but really quite stunned because I had been out trying to get people to name that room for a large donation, and no one came forward to do it. And so it didn't have a name on it. So I was pleased that I was able to, that the president agreed to do it. But then I told everybody, I said, and don't tell anyone. I didn't think it was appropriate that it would be announced while the building was being built that the reading room was being named for an employee of the university. I found that not right. So I said, I accept the honor, and I'll be very glad when it would happen, but it has to happen concurrent with my retirement, so that it's seen as being kind of a recognition. What would happen if I left before the building was done? Would they still name it? I mean, it makes no sense. So but I'm very honored, and I'm very, very happy to have it, because to me it represents coming together of the historical role of the libraries, the large reading room. I didn't go to a university that had a large reading room because Iowa was the first, what we referred to as a supermarket library, where the stacks and study space were integrated. And that's what a lot of people know today. But before that, before 1950, all libraries had reading rooms because stacks were closed, and you had to call for the books to come up. And so now, more or less, we're in the position again where we can do that, because a reading room is the synonymous statement about what a library's heritage is. And in today's world, where we're not doing that much in the way of browsing, because so many of our books are electronic now, and our journals, that it's almost like we have a closed stack, not exactly the same, but it's almost like we have a closed stack environment again. So I'm very pleased to have had that honor.
One of my favorite things about the building is the reading room and the way that you integrated the history of the power plant into the new space. And I think that this is something that I personally find unusual in a library dean, is that you've always been committed to both the forward-thinking vision for the libraries as well as the archives, the history, the preservation piece. Certainly the Archives and Special Collections has really benefited from your support since 2004. Are there things you'd like to talk about in terms of the growth of that area?
Well, I'll speak just very briefly about the artifacts that are in the WALC. And that is that the power plant that sat there, I always have a problem with something being considered irrelevant. that is not part of the academic mission. And to me, that plant, which if it had not been there and provided power for as many years as it did, all of Purdue would not have functioned without the heat and power generated by that plant. And to not recognize that, also the fact that science and engineering is such a critical part of Purdue, to not recognize what engineers and scientists do in such a facility like the power plant. So I was glad that we were able to save artifacts from the building, display them in the walk, and also tell a story. And by the video or the audio tour that we have done, we actually challenge the listener to create their own story. So they actually become an active learner by walking through the building and listening to the audio tour. So, but going back to and a lot of what I comes from is the fact that I do love history. And so I think I'm very conscious of where we've come from as well as where we're going. And so when I arrived here, I had no idea that Purdue had anything in the way of archives and special collections. I had been at IU long enough to know that IU had a preeminent rare book library with the Gutenberg Bible and, I mean, just incredible collections in the Lilly Library. Purdue was never known. I mean, we never thought of Purdue as having anything valuable in the area of rare books or archives. And then when I arrived, you had this exhibit that was called Voices That Changed the World. Is that the title for it?
Yes.
And I remember walking through the old reading room and where archives and special collections were located, and you had this exhibit. And I was standing there looking at him, and there was Newton's Principia, Copernicus, Adam Smith, and I asked you, where did you borrow these from? And you said, oh, they're ours. And I said, really? And you said, yes. And I said, where are they? And they said, oh, they're in closets and storerooms around the various libraries. And that's when I realized that most of the libraries had some rare book collections, and archives were catch as catch can, because there was no designation of university archives. And I thought, okay, if we're going to combine the libraries in the future, the first thing we have to do is combine all of the rare books and archives in one place. And they have to be housed appropriately. And right now, they were housed very poorly. I think you would agree that they couldn't have been in much worse condition. They were ripe for being, I mean, the security, the environment, nothing was right. But luckily, we had a rough diamond, or a diamond in the rough, upstairs on the 4th floor of HISI that had been both study spaces for graduate students and faculty, and also storage for books. And it was kind of like a godsend to find something like that had outlived its purpose, but now could be repurposed into something that would be so great to be able to showcase and bring together our archives and special collections. So working with you, Sammie, and with all of the other people in archives and special collections, and with some very important donors, we were able to create a beautiful reading room and a vault that has the proper environmental control aspect. And at the time when we moved into it, we thought, oh, wow, we've got so much space. Now we realize we are so in need of additional space. But also, too, with your leadership, we also understood how to take some new initiatives in creating user spaces that had not been built typically in archives and special collections, such as the classroom to be able to use materials and teach. And I think that what's really happened that's been very dynamic and exciting has been the integration of archives and special collections into the teaching, instruction of our students and faculty. I find that to be using primary materials as an undergraduate, I think is unique. And an opportunity that I would have given anything to have as an undergraduate that I didn't have.
I would lay bets that you would have become an archivist if you had learned with primary sources when you were in school. That's just my own opinion.
That I would have become an archivist?
Yes.
Probably.
Well, Jim, I know we're kind of wrapping up on a long and very important career, and I wanted to talk with you briefly about how you might characterize your own time at Purdue if 20, 50 years from now we have a sentence capturing the tenure of each dean. What would you like to see represented as part of your legacy, your time here?
Well, I guess what I would hope would be their assessment is that I transitioned the libraries into the 21st century successfully. I think that we have re-identified ourselves as a 21st century research library. I hope we've done it successfully. I don't know if I can say for sure we have. I think in 20 or 30 years, looking back, they'll be able to tell. One of the things that I tend to do is looking back and seeing where we've come from, not only Purdue, but libraries in general. And I realize that there have been times where things have changed so dramatically, so quickly, that we have almost lost touch of what those changes were. But once they happen, they become standard, they become the norm. And you look back at it and you think, when the first person, like Mr. Moriarty, who was the librarian from 44 to 78, he brought microforms into the library. Mm-hmm. And you think, what an incredible thing that must have been when he brought and introduced microforms into the library. He probably also brought the first copier machines into the library. And what an incredible thing that was. Well, within a few years, that was an assumption that these would always be here. And now we look at them and think that they're antiquated. Mm-hmm. So you have to always remember that hopefully you're going to do something to move things forward, not to hold them back, and at the same time, hope that you didn't jettison something that was absolutely critical. Because that was the thing that we also had to do here during the last 14 years. We had to jettison some things that we had always been doing. We switched from Dewey to Library of Congress in order to be able to streamline the receipt of materials. We dropped an approval plan and went to another approval plan. We stopped reference service, reference librarians on the reference desk. So there were all kinds of things that in the past would have been inconceivable. We've withdrawn books. We've withdrawn 350,000 volumes in the last several years. That would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. So my hope is that the things that we've done to bring the libraries forward are not at the cost of jettisoning some things that we shouldn't have done. Only the future will tell. We have very dynamic library faculty. Our library faculty, I think, has become much more identified as a faculty with a discipline, so that people see and understand what it is we contribute both to instruction and to research. And that I find to be very, very exciting. I look back and think that I've done what I thought what needed to be done. I hope I haven't caused any serious damage, and I hope that on the whole the libraries have progressed. But it never could have been done by myself. No one person can do it by themselves.
Well, just to put this ending in context, I think you began in the libraries in 2004, not long after I began in 2003. I think we both recognized when we joined the Purdue libraries that in comparison to our peers in the Big Ten, we were not at the top. And then suddenly, within the time that you were here, we achieved this new building. We had set all of these precedents with data and information literacy, and we also were recognized as by the ACRL as the leading library in 2015, I believe. Is that right?
We received the University Library of the Year award.
Yes. So I think the one thing I'd like to end on is looking back, what is the accomplishment that you're most proud of?
It's hard to point to one thing. I think it's overall the people's perception that the libraries are not an anachronism, that the libraries have redefined themselves, and that we are a very critical component of the academic mission. I I think in the past, we were always seen as being ancillary to the academic mission of the university. People always said that we were the heart of the university. And oftentimes I was at places that I said, well, if we are the heart of the university, we're on life support because we were not funded the way we should have been. And so I think that now the libraries, among the academics and the administration, they see us as a very important and critical part of the university and a visible part. I think in the past, libraries had a tendency to say, if we just stay really, really low-keyed and out of sight, people won't notice us and they won't try to cut us back or all this. And I thought, well, that's the worst way to do it. If you try to be low-keyed or low profile, that's most likely when you're going to get cut because people won't understand what you're doing to contribute. I think that one of the exciting opportunities we now have is having specialists within the libraries who have specialized skills, knowledge like assessment, communication, to help us tell our story, help us assess our input or our impact. So I think those are exciting attributes. We've done something at Purdue that other libraries are now following, and that is bringing people in who have a specialized knowledge outside of the libraries that in the past librarians have done, but may not have done it the best that could have been done because it was kind of a learned attribute or learned skill, whereas bringing somebody in who really understands what it is that needs to be done, like web design and web assessment, or assessment in general, and using statistical analysis of trying to determine what impact we have on the success of our students. That's been something that we've really focused on. I find that very exciting. I think that what's happened in archives and special collections is an area that I'm particularly proud of. To see the value that the university has placed on the archives of the university, archives of outstanding individuals who've been associated with Purdue, and the rare books that we have. I think that's also speaks to me because of my love of history and knowing that Purdue is set to move on for its next 150 years.